As a fan of comedy, I often hear people talk about how comedy movies are a dead genre, that there hasn't really been anything good since Superbad, like maybe 21 Jump Street. And that made me wonder how much of that feeling is influenced by nostalgia or just the current content overload of media. So I started with somebody that I trust, Judd Apatow. Judd's contribution to comedy as a writer, director, and producer is astounding. And looking at the height of his career, we see Superbad, Knocked Up, Step Brothers, Don't Mess with the Zohan, Pineapple Express, and Funny People all being released in a 3-year span. In thinking about 2007 to 2009, I wondered if there was any research or discourse around the financial crisis and American comedy movies, and there really is not. Which brings me to ask, did the global financial crisis, also known as the Great Recession or simply the Recession, influence comedy films, and how can that help us define the current climate and near future of comedy in America? I'm talking about movies, so I'm talking about the film industry and its relationship to a country's economy. 100 years before the financial crisis, there was the Italian financial crisis. From 1907 to 1908, there was an international business recession that slowed industrial growth in Italy. Inflation compounded with unemployment, entrepreneurs struggling to find capital, overproduction in multiple industries, and the cost of living was skyrocketing. At the same time, the film industry was actually growing. In Film History, Volume 3, Number 4, Bernardini describes a narrative crisis in the global film industry, as in audiences demanding for more interesting storytelling. In Italy, production companies weren't monopolized, and they operated with more creative freedom compared to other countries in the world. Due to the weak economy, larger films sought budget-friendly productions, and smaller films required bank loans just to get off the ground. In 1908, Arturo Ambrosio released Italy's first globally successful film, The Last Days of Pompeii. The Last Days of Pompeii is categorized as a spectacle film. It shows people in situations that audiences wouldn't have naturally imagined themselves in beforehand, such as slavery, love potions, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, etc. I bring this up because philosopher Anna Kowalik defines comedy and film both as spectacles in Western culture, as they are performances that arouse admiration and are subjected to the interpretation of the presented sequence of events. Colloquially, we can say that comedy is likable, subjective, and presents a narrative that audiences interpret. By the comic theory writings of Edward Fink in the Journal of Film and Video, good comedy contains absurdities, logical extremes, and unexpected surprises, to name a few. Going forward in discussing American comedy movies and the economy, it's important to think about this pattern: emerging industry, budget cuts, audience demand, and spectacle. Now let's think about American comedy. With film came comedy. Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, just to name a few. Fast forward to 1978. National Lampoon released Animal House to shocking success. It became the first blockbuster comedy movie in America. It grossed over $100 million at the box office. Animal House set the tone for future American comedy movies using low humor, guy humor, and mocking the establishment. National Lampoon, if you did not know, was an American comedy magazine. It collapsed in the 1990s, and while they still made films up to 2015, the company's peak was certainly in the 70s and 80s. Moving on to the 90s, the 1990s is considered to be one of the best decades for the US economy. With that, we saw comedy movies such as Happy Gilmore, Clueless, Beethoven, Wayne's World, and Dumb and Dumber being released. All of these films saw massive blockbuster success. By the 2000s, it's pretty easy to consider blockbuster comedy as a relatively new industry. It had only been around for about 20 years, but there were enough films produced to leave audiences ripe for reinvention. In terms of the country, there was a brief recession in 2001, and by 2006, the economy was slowing and starting to take a turn for the worse. Comedy blockbusters are our emerging industry. The 2000s brought budget cuts, the writers brought reinvention. These are the films that I think capitalized on the moment and, in my opinion, defined the recession era. Little Miss Sunshine, 2006. Screenplay by Michael Arndt, directed by Valerie Faris and Jonathan Dayton. It had a budget of $8 million and a box office opening of $101 million. It won Best Screenplay in 2007, and the original first draft was written in the year 2000. Little Miss Sunshine follows the Hoover family. The youngest, 7 years old, Olive, is unexpectedly accepted into the Little Miss Sunshine pageant, and the family must get from Albuquerque, New Mexico to LA. This comes just after Cheryl's brother Frank has attempted suicide. Additionally, her son Dwayne has taken a vow of silence, her husband Richard's self-help success book is failing to sell, and Richard's father Edwin has moved in with them after getting kicked out of his retirement community for using heroin. Now, interestingly, President Hoover actually served during the onset of the Great Depression, and in Little Miss Sunshine, the Hoover family is facing financial bankruptcy. It could be a coincidence, but I don't believe it is. Juno, 2007, screenplay by Diablo Cody, directed by Jason Reitman, with a budget of $6.5 million. It had a box office opening of $231.4 million. It won Best Screenplay in 2008. Juno follows Juno McGuff after she loses her virginity to her friend Polly Bleecker. She becomes pregnant and decides to give the baby to Vanessa and Mark. Mark and Juno's relationship crosses boundaries and puts the adoption in jeopardy. And the final film is Superbad, 2007. Screenplay by Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, directed by Greg Mottola, with a budget of $20 million and a box office opening of $170.8 million. The original screenplay was written in 1995 by 13-year-old Seth and Evan. Seth and Evan are best friends in their senior year of high school. Evan has been accepted into Dartmouth along with their other friend Fogel. The boys have been invited to a house party by their crushes Jules and Becca and promised to get them booze with Fogel's fake ID. Fogel is swept away by two cops, leaving Seth and Evan to bumble around another party looking for booze to bring to the girls. In 2007, Michael Lombardo became HBO's president of programming, where he remained for 12 years. In short, he knows something about television. In an interview with NBC News in 2009 regarding the recession's impact on pop culture and entertainment programming, Lombardo stated, "Our programming, although hopefully being entertaining, is grounded in reality. I don't think we've ever been a company that's looked for escapist programming." In Little Miss Sunshine, Juno, and Superbad, a binary view of gender and shaken gender roles is the greatest connecting theme. Diane Negra and Yvonne Tasker examine how popular media tells stories about the recession because they were produced in a recessionary climate. They talk about women's success in the recession and men's failures. I would like to further Negra and Tasker's analysis by defining this gender study as how the recession gave educated white women an opportunity to defy the patriarchy, while previous patriarchal standards devastated the emotional health of working class men. So, in the media's depiction of these recession-era stories, we see educated white women reinventing themselves as caretakers, while working class men were left helplessly unable to provide for their families single-handedly. Tasker and Negra get into how women were immune to the recession. The recession was an opportunity of self-makeover and career and reproductive choices, and an overarching belief that women are doing better than men in the films that they analyzed. In Juno, Juno is 16 and pregnant, yet she still carries an indifferent confidence. Juno also chooses pregnancy rather altruistically. She decides that this is an opportunity to help someone and sacrifices her body and her reputation to do so. Her boyfriend, not boyfriend, love interest, not love interest, Bleecker is left unable to express himself to Juno, leaving her to decide their relationship entirely. The movie amounts to Juno and Bleecker learning to tell each other that they love the other, but throughout the film, Juno can express her more basic feelings to Bleecker, but he can't do the same to her. When Juno tells Bleecker that they were never together, Bleecker shuts down, and he can't effectively express that having sex with Juno actually meant something to him. At the end of the film, when Juno apologizes, it's because Juno has decided to find empathy for Bleecker's perspective, not because he expresses himself to her. For an audience of young women, Juno's character is very empowering. She chooses what she wants to do with her pregnancy, her relationship. She has no power or self-expression ever taken away from her. And as for the family that decides to adopt Juno's baby, Vanessa is unbelievably prepared. Emotionally, physically, the house is ready, the walls are painted. Mark only tells Vanessa his feelings after making a move on Juno, which leaves Juno in tears and Vanessa asking Mark to explain himself. But instead of Mark telling Vanessa that he is attracted to this 16-year-old pregnant girl, he tells Vanessa that he is unable to be a father and thinks he needs a divorce. This is a man who is unable to adapt or express his feelings in any way. In the end, Vanessa shows herself to be resilient and adaptable by caring for the baby as a single mother. In Superbad, Becca and Jules are relatively underdeveloped characters. They are Seth and Evan's love interests, but they are idolized and nearly flawless. They are confident and kind and generous to the boys. Becca's one wish was for Evan to bring her Gold Slick vodka. That vodka does not make it to the party, but Becca does not waste a moment crying about it or complaining about it. She does not care at all. She is actually already wasted by the time the boys get to the party. Becca's one flaw is that she does drink too much at this party and squanders her chance of hooking up with Evan. But the moment is still played out in an endearing way, as Becca's friend attributes her drinking to waiting for Evan all night because she just likes him so much. Jules is Seth's love interest. Seth interprets Jules as being too good for him and thinks that she needs to be drunk in order to hook up with him. But Jules tells him that she actually doesn't drink and maybe could have hooked up with Seth if he wasn't so drunk. Seth embarrasses himself and then infamously gives Jules a black eye. Yet, the next day, Jules sets herself up with Seth and sets Becca up with Evan when they run into each other at the mall. In this representation of women, we see them as pretty perfect. Becca and Jules don't care if Seth and Evan actually bring booze. They don't care if they're too drunk or too sober or awkward or unpopular. They aren't bothered by anything. They just like them for who they are. And that's why the boys, and in turn the audience, love the girls so much. They're resilient and adaptable. Now, that might sound like a stretch, but in Negra and Tasker's observations, media doesn't need to make direct comments about the economy to be influenced by certain values and desires an audience in that economy would want. In Superbad, they're showing women who can take care of men's egos and insecurities, and at a time when men would have been losing their job and facing, an inability to be providers. Having sort of fantasy women like that in media would have been extra appealing to a male audience. In Jennifer Huemmer's textual analysis of Superbad, titled Boobs and Beer, Analysis of Masculine Rites of Passage in the film Superbad, she reinforces why fantasy women like Becca and Jules are so generous, especially generous to these boys, in saying that the shifting boundaries of hegemonic masculinity cause many American men to live in constant fear that they will someday be emasculated. So what she's saying is that Becca and Jules' characters work to counter feelings of being emasculated, and that's why they're such positive forces in the film, and that is why the boys are so obsessed with them. This quote also reinforces Frank's character in Little Miss Sunshine. In Act 1, while the family eats dinner, Frank humorously explains to Olive why he tried to kill himself. The final straw being that his ex-lover's new lover is awarded the Genius Award and recognized by America's #1 Proust scholar. Being the #1 Proust scholar in America is a part of Frank's identity, and being stripped of that title was emasculating and is deemed the reason that Frank wanted to end his life. The image of resilient women is not lost in Little Miss Sunshine either. The mother Cheryl and the daughter Olive are the only women in the family. They are both the most positive forces in the family as well. Cheryl holds the family together financially, but she is also the person that physically puts everybody in a van together to get Olive to the pageant. And Olive, in the end, brings the family together emotionally when she does her final dance performance in tribute of their grandfather and gets the entire family on stage to dance together and finally unite. Negra and Tasker also outline the ways in which working-class men failed during the recession. The working-class man's inability to provide for his family as a breadwinner challenged self-image and masculinity. In Little Miss Sunshine, Richard has written a book on how to be a winner and succeed in life. Ironically, he is broke, relying on Cheryl to provide for him financially, and he cannot sell the book. In the second act climax of the film, Richard is told that the book will not be bought and is faced with the reality that his dream is dead and the family may become bankrupt because of it. Richard attempts to persuade Stan Grossman and is confronted with the reality that his dream will not come true. He continues on driving the bus to California in an act of resilience. When his father passes, Richard carries the brunt of the bumps in the road. He gets the family out of the hospital, back onto the road, he gets the police officer off their back, he gets the van to the hotel, and he convinces the organizers at the front desk to let Olive enroll even though they are 5 minutes late. And he is the first person to jump the stage when Olive is asked to leave during her performance. To an audience, Richard is an example of how a failed breadwinner can be humiliated by patriarchal standards and still follow through as a positive force in the family dynamic. Rather than trying to sell the qualities of winners to others, he finally embodies them and displays assertiveness, confidence, and certainty of success. The son, Dwayne's character arc, is defined by his belief that he comes from a family of losers, divorce, bankrupt, suicide. He says it himself. Dwayne is fixated on the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. One of Nietzsche's main beliefs, if you don't know, is that heaven was not real and that God is dead. For the sake of easing your mind, Dwayne's mentality is challenged by Frank, as he is a Proust scholar. Frank gives a speech to Dwayne in the film that Proust believed that his most valuable years were the ones where he suffered, because those were the years where he learned the most about the world and himself. In Little Miss Sunshine, Frank and Dwayne are not men who are breadwinners or providers. They're both being taken care of by Cheryl, and so they are given the responsibility of defining the philosophy of the film. Frank and Dwayne are talking to the audience, an audience contextualized in the recession, about their current sufferings and what the value of that is. Cheryl is clearly resilient. She provides for the family financially. She presumably takes care of dinner every night and also takes care of her brother and her kids. Olive is confident in herself and resilient in her pursuit of being a beauty queen, despite being presented with the fact that she is not a conventional beauty queen. We watch Olive reckon with her ability to be a beauty queen when Richard tells her that skinny women don't eat ice cream, and she is visibly uncomfortable backstage at the Little Miss Sunshine pageant. But Richard, Frank, and Dwayne are resilient in a more passive way. They reckon with internal struggles like mental health, their anger, their masculinity, in order to connect with the family. Now, what made these films so memorable? They're all character-driven stories, as opposed to something high concept like an alien invasion or a zombie invasion. These plots are only interesting stories because the audience cares about the characters. In a recession era, it can be assumed that audiences toe a special line. They may not want to watch films flaunting excessive wealth, but they also probably don't want to see relatable characters lose their jobs in the same way that they might have lost their job. The Hoovers are going bankrupt, not because anybody got laid off, but because Richard's niche dream of being a motivational speaker and self-help author didn't work out. It's a relatable feeling, but not necessarily a relatable situation. In Juno overcomes her independence, opens up to Bleecker, and chooses to pursue an emotionally intimate relationship with him. The teen pregnancy and drama with Vanessa and Mark make the movie interesting, but Juno's growth is catharsis in itself. In Superbad, Seth and Evan, and separately McLevin, experience a crazy adventure akin to what Evan tells Becca they're supposedly doing every weekend. In the end, they realize that the girls already like them and they don't have to prove themselves to receive that. It's a relatable feeling, and you don't have to be hit by a car to understand that. Also, it's important to mention that these movies were not written as a response to the recession. They were released at the onset of it. But they resonated with audiences and critics in part due to the country's climate at the time of their release. I believe blockbuster comedy movies soared during the recession because when you watch a comedy, there is trust that everything will be fine and there will be a happy ending. The tension, the buildup will all be worth it because at the end, a punchline always comes. The magic of movies like Superbad, Juno, and Little Miss Sunshine are that they were indie comedies with massive theatrical releases. Where did that go? I mean, what else started in 2008? The highest grossing film franchise in history. What are the top grossing films of all time? The Avengers, The Avengers, The Avengers, and The Avengers. Producers will never pump money into comedy the same again. And that brings me to today's comedy. Triangle of Sadness, 2022. Screenplay by Ruben Östlund, directed by Ruben Östlund, Budget of $15.6 million with a box office of $11.4 million. It won the Palme d'Or. This is Ruben Östlund's first English language feature. However, it does feature European characters that speak French and German, amongst other languages, and it is a black comedy. The production was first announced in 2017. I'm also aware that Ruben Östlund is a Swedish filmmaker, and this is not an American film. However, I'm lumping it in because I believe that in the coming months, Triangle of Sadness will be very popular on HBO Max. And with the way that streaming services run the film industry at the moment, I don't really see much value in focusing just on American directors and American comedy films when talking about today's comedy. Triangle of Sadness follows Yaya and Carl, both fashion models, in a cloud-based relationship. They decide to go on a cruise for the super rich. The employees of the cruise are hyper-focused on pleasing the guests for tips. The captain is an alcoholic and a communist, and when the cruise ship hits a storm, the captain befriends a Russian capitalist while the yacht sinks. After the yacht sinks, the survivors are left stranded on an island. Everything Everywhere All at Once, 2022. Screenplay by Daniel Kwan and Daniel Schneider. Directed by Daniel Kwan and Daniel Schneider, professionally known as the Daniels. Budget of $14.3 million with a box office of $101.8 million. This is an English and Cantonese film, and it's a sci-fi comedy that borders absurd. Evelyn and Huemmer are Chinese-American immigrants who run a laundromat and are being audited by the IRS. An interdimensional rupture unravels reality, and Evelyn must channel the various versions of herself from across the multiverse to fight a mysterious force wreaking havoc. Evelyn must confront problems in her marriage, as well as how she treats her daughter's girlfriend. We can see that in these new comedies, they are more globally integrated. They're not about white people or Americans or the middle class. They reflect a world where we are all very much on top of each other, not just virtually, but also physically. In 1960, 2.6% of the world's population were global migrants. In 2015, it was reported that 3.3% of the world's population were global migrants. And the characters in these films are often not facing individualized issues, like being pregnant or moving to a new city. The conflict comes from too much consumerism and media overload. There's a direct criticism of capitalism and the government, and these new comedies are concerned with something bigger and more existential than a relatable or generalized experience. I think going forward, it will be hard to have singular blockbuster movies that beget massive audiences. I think comedies are going to become relatively indie again, and I also think they're going to become more critically acclaimed. And by critically acclaimed, I just mean that compared to previous eras of a lot of films, I think comedy scripts are going to have a bit of a resurgence. When you watch Triangle of Sadness and Everything Everywhere, it's obvious that they both have relatively complicated plots and story structures. Both of these films are told in 3 chapters: Before the Cruise, and the Island, Everything, Everywhere, and All at Once. In this resurgence, I think there will be a greater emphasis on high-concept plots and cinematography rather than character-driven stories. So, if you're sitting around on the coattails of the pandemic, waiting for the next recession, and feeling like the only movie that premiered this year was Minions: Rise of Gru, don't worry. There are comedies out there, but you might just have to go to a local theater or a streaming service to find them.